দুর্গমগিরি কান্তার মরুদুতর পারাবার হে দন্ধিতে হবে রাত্রে দিতে যাত্রীরা হুঁশিয়ার.
Chapter 10. First Smell of Victory. Today, March 25th, 2008, I feel sad and withdrawn in the prison cell as I hear BTV recalling many heroic events of our liberation war in 1971. Could this senior citizen ever think in his heady youth that the table would turn in such treacherous ways? Is it destiny or a victory of malevolent force? I have to wait it out. 1971. After having organized whatever resistance we could in Meherpur, I looked for ways to further strengthen our efforts. Mahbub, an old buddy of mine since high school days, was serving as Subdivisional Officer of Police, SDPO, at Jhinaidaho, some 40 miles away in another district, Jashore, where the army had a cantonment. I knew well his leanings and got in touch with him for an update on the situation in Jhinaidaho. Mahbub was all charged up and asked me to go over to his place for consultation. On March 23rd, I drove to Jhinaidaho through Chuadanga to a roadside rest house in Jhinaidaho, an innocuous place fixed as our rendezvous. Mahbub had called our colleagues from neighboring districts to join us. I was pleasantly surprised to find Waliul Islam, SDO Magura, Shah Muhammad Farid, SDO Gwalando, and Kamaluddin Siddiq, SDO Norail, waiting at the rest house. Over lunch, we exchanged notes, reviewed the deep concern the dead end the country was heading to, and agreed to work out defensive strategies in our respective subdivisions in case of military assault, which looked imminent. Keep in touch and coordinate our moves. Ironically, March 23rd was the Republic Day of Pakistan, and here we were, the standard bearers of Pakistan, coordinating our moves to bring it down. Mahbub informed me that he had seen a lethally armed contingent of Pakistan Army move from Jashore cantonment towards Kushtia via Jhinaidaho. Given Meherpur's short distance from Kushtia, I was concerned that some elements could move to Meherpur at a short notice in matter of an hour. We were not safe in our primitive preparation and needed to fortify our position. Two sources came to mind. Meherpur's border with India was manned by East Pakistan Rifles, in short, EPR, a paramilitary force mostly comprising Bengalis, at first at several border outposts, in short, BOPs. I was confident that the political movement for the independence of East Pakistan had gained such momentum and pervasiveness that no corners, including BOPs, were left untouched by the wave. Couriers were sent secretly to establish contact with Bengalis in EPR and encourage them to join us when the moment came. They came back to report that the ERP at the BOPs were ready and would wait for a signal from us. This news was greatly reassuring. The other reinforcement would come from India, an avowed enemy of Pakistan, but that had to wait. However, we were convinced that there was a long distance to traverse, spilled with blood. The Pak army, which had cast its net all around East Pakistan, was not going to return to barracks without the pound of flesh it had planned for. We knew that we were not trained nor equipped against a professional army, but our dream, our spirit, and determination made up for all that. Being far removed from Dhaka, patchy information and rumors were all that we could come by. A sense of impending danger of immense proportions took a gripping hold on us. The small town of Meherpur was on the edge, looking down a void, a waiting that needed to be over, come what may. March 25th, 1971 was the tipping point and the beginning of the end of our struggle for independence and liberation. Past midnight, 25th March, my orderly Osman woke me up to inform me the inspector of police wanted to see me urgently. Meherpur did not have an SDPO because it was too small to deserve one and had to do with an inspector of police, one notch lower than an SDPO. The middle-aged police officer, visibly shaken, said that the hell had been let loose in Dhaka and wanted me to go to the police wireless station right away. The adrenaline shot through me as I realized that day of reckoning had arrived. Quickly changing from my pajamas, I drove to the police station and jumped out to rush to the wireless room. The policemen were glued to it with noises rattling out. As they made room for me, I heard a voice from the other side, hardly audible. "It's all over here. They have come with tanks and guns, blasting all the way to Rajarbagh Police Headquarters." A pause, and then a burst of gunfire came through the wireless. I pressed, "Hello? Hello? Do you hear me? Rajarbagh, are you there? This is Meherpur." The wireless operator fell silent, possibly hit by one of the enemy's bullets. As I drove back through a town that was fast in slumber, a rush of thoughts crossed my mind. What's next? I called for Shohiuddin and Nurul Haq to my bungalow. They turned up in no time, briefing them on what I had heard of the massacre at Rajarbagh. I suggested that we all get together right away at the Bazaar crossing to take a collective stance against any attack by Pak Army. The town was aroused. Volunteer students started assembling, as also the Ansars and the Mujahids. They raised full-throated slogan of Joy Bangla, which reverberated through the sleepy streets and narrow alleys, melting away the darkness of night. I mounted a table to address the crowd. Friends, this meeting in the middle of the night speaks of the urgency. I just talked to the wireless operator of Rajarbagh Police Headquarters in Dhaka. The Pakistan Army has attacked with tanks and heavy guns, blasting through. The operator fell before he could finish speaking. Rajarbagh has been reduced to rubble with piles of dead. I'm sure the army is doing the same the other parts of Dhaka to silence us and bury our dream in one hellish pit. But together we have to stand up against this brute force and show that we are a nation that can fight back and lay down our lives for our freedom. Let Bangladesh be their final burial ground. Remember what Bangabandhu told us at the rally on 7th March at Racecourse. Ebarer Shongram, Muktir Shongram, Ebarer Shongram, Shadhinatar Shongram. The crowd shot back. We are ready. Joy Bangla. Joy Bangla. I continued. I am no more the SDO you had known for so long, but one of you. Count me as one of your comrades in arms. A crowd of young people with steely determination, vowing to fight to the end, reassured me. With a sprinkle of light shining dimly around the silver of the waning moon, throwing a mystical aura, the late night scene was surreal preparation for an armed struggle. We hardly knew what awaited us. By early morning, my office had turned into the headquarters of resistance forces, and all activities gravitated around my compound, teeming with people of all classes and persuasions. We decided to draw up defense to secure Meherpur from any advances of the enemy. The most likely route from Kushtia was to march directly, the narrow Mathabhanga River, roughly halfway, forming a natural barrier. A group of armed Ansars, Mujahid with 303 rifles and 15-20 bullets each, along with student volunteers, was sent to take up positions along the river and bring the hand-drawn ferry to our side. It was also decided to cut down the branches of tree lining the road to create obstructions where we to retreat. Another small group, similarly armed, was sent to take up the defensive position if the enemy was to advance through Chuadanga. Messages were sent to the BOPs, informing members of ERP about happenings in Dhaka and asked them to disarm their non-Bengali peers. In the meantime, a Pakistani army major from Jeshore cantonment had come to disarm the Bengali members of ERP at the BOPs, sparking an armed encounters in which the major was killed. This incident traveled like a wildfire to all the BOPs, lending credence to the motives of Pakistan Army and triggering a full-scale takeover of all BOPs by Bengali EPR members. I decided to seek assistance from India, knowing that we were ill-prepared to face an onslaught from the enemy. Somehow, I had to reach the Indian administration across the border. The much-dreaded smugglers who made a living doing illegal trade across the borders were my hope as couriers. Early in the morning of 26th March, I wrote an open letter. To our Indian brethren, please help us with arms and ammunition. With my signature and official seal at the bottom for authenticity. Several copies were made and the couriers were asked to deliver them to the member of the press and administrative officials across the border in India. Elated at being recognized for and entrusted with such a responsibility, the couriers left after assuring me that they wouldn't return before the job was done. The letter was delivered to many quarters. As I would learn later, it featured prominently on the front pages of Indian dailies published from Calcutta. I was putting my mother along with two brothers living in Dhaka at risk should the Pak intelligence agencies were able to put two and two together and track them down. Their wrath would fall on them, since I had not only taken up arms against Pakistan but had gone to seek help from India. But this was no time for careful calculations. God was there to take care of us and ours. There was a good news from Chuadanga, headquarters of the EPR. Major Osman Chowdhury, the wing commander who had been called to Kushtia for briefing by Pak Army, returned to Chuadanga only to see Bangladesh flag flying atop his office. His men welcomed him with thunderous slogans of Joy Bangla. Captain Azam Chowdhury, the second in command, briefed him with the happenings at the outpost and the decision to abandon allegiance to Pakistan and instead fight against them. Major Osman welcomed their decision, took the command of the situation, and in turn told the troops about the deployment of soldiers at Kushtia and their intentions. It was clear that although Pakistan Army had unleashed a lethal killing machine in Dhaka, it had misjudged the depth and the pervasiveness of popular hostility towards the army throughout Bangladesh, thinking that a mass murder in Dhaka would quell the rest of the country. The Pakistanis always thought of us as timid race, fish and rice-eating small-statured people devoid of any martial traditions. How else would they have called Major Osman for a briefing and let him go back to his station for duty? I saw a window of opportunity in their complacency. I dashed to Chuadanga with the Bangladesh flag fluttering on my jeep. I slowed down occasionally on the way to wave at groups of people by the roadside who greeted me chanting Joy Bangla, which I returned. It was a slogan that now bound us together on our uncharted path to freedom. At Amjhupi, Bajar, a short distance from infamous Nilkuthi, I made a brief stop to address the crowd that had gathered spontaneously, urging them to prepare for the armed struggle ahead, like a messenger announcing a sermon. Joy Bangla was their rapturous reply in chorus. Chuadanga, A much bigger town than Meherpur was no different. Crowds cheering my jeep as I drove past, chanting, Joy Bangla. I met Major Osman in khaki uniform in his office, a short, well-built, muscular and square-faced man with a strong jaw, fair by Bangladeshi standards, and in fact could easily pass for a West Pakistani officer from the frontier. He welcomed me as we sat down to do the stock-taking with a melee of civil leaders teeming in his headquarters. Among them was one I came to know later, Barrister Asabul Haq, with a revolver in his upholster. Captain Azam, a tall, lanky fellow with occasional stammer, also joined. Chowdhury had been christened as the Southwestern Command of Liberation Forces. The weighty name gave us confidence as we were being inducted to yet more serious business. In my office, Major Osman, there were maps pinned to the wall in various markings, all Greek to me. His assessment was that Pak Army contingent at Kushtia wouldn't move out of their stronghold anytime soon. That was music to my ears. Meherpur was safe, at least for now. For a prolonged discussion, it was decided not to sit around but to plan an attack on army positions in Kushtia. I didn't quite comprehend what it all meant in military terms, but informed the meeting of the answers, the Mujahids and the civil volunteers mobilized in Meherpur, and my attempts to reach Indian government for help with arms and ammunition. Major Osman appreciated my initiatives, asked me to wait for orders from him and keep him posted about the development across the border. I left Chowdhury renewed in courage. The couriers came back with information that Indian officials would like to meet me, to which I readily agreed. It was fixed for 10 a.m. on 29th March at Betai, BOP, just across Meherpur on the Indian side. I made an intuitive but strategic assessment about India's possible role and attitude towards our armed struggle. Pakistan and India had been sworn enemies of each other since partition of 1947. It would be in India's interest to support any movement that weakened Pakistan, better still if it were broken in two. We had to use this convergent goal in our best interests. I had an uncanny feeling that it was going to be long before we could expect any significant support. Given the international obligation to respect the sovereignty of other countries, India would not jump at any opportunity, but I had to make a bid for it. The Indian border outpost of Betai was only a couple of miles west of Meherpur town. One of the cornerstones of Pakistan's strategy along the East Pakistan border was to make all crossings as difficult as possible to preclude any association between two sides and make any incursions from Indian side difficult. Thus, roads abruptly came to an end as one would approach the border. I drove up to some length, left the jeep and started walking with the courier beside me. Soon we left the remains of the Kacha road and started walking over the fields, along the narrow path through bushes, a terrain which did not seem to have been traveled for a long time. A CSP officer, trained in the tradition of the British Raj, standard bearer of the authority of the central government of Pakistan, at this remote subdivision, I was making the first dangerous move to join hands with Pakistani's arch enemy to work out the manners of its demise. Soon, a BSF officer, Captain Yadav, as I gathered later, appeared from nowhere to receive me. I was taken to the border outpost, made by barracks and an office block flying the Indian flag. There, Mr. Bhattacharya, the district magistrate, in short, DM, of Krishnanagar and Lieutenant Colonel Chakraborty, BSF commander, cordially received me. "You are the first ambassador from Bangladesh," said Mr. Bhattacharya, and he gestured me to the side where men in uniform were lined up. "So we would like to give you a guard of honor." I was taken by surprise and moved by it all. The guard was presented and I inspected the guard. "Your short cheat asked for help from India raised quite a storm. All the Calcutta dailies printed it on the front page. We were asked to get in touch with you without delay," continued the DM. I thanked him and his colleagues for the courtesy shown to me. The three of us sat down in the office to discuss the situation while tea and cookies were served. Although taken by surprise at the move of an SDO, Bhattacharya and Chakraborty wanted to know more about us and assess what was happening across the border. I told them about the brutal crackdowns in Dhaka, where untold numbers of innocent people had been gunned down in a mass orgy by the Pak army. We were an independent country now and had vowed to drive the Pakis from our soil. We were about to launch an attack on their position in Kushtia. The whole of Bangladesh had risen in arms as one unified force against the enemy. In Meherpur specifically, the Ansar and the Mujahids, the paramilitary forces, had been mobilized, armed, and dispatched towards Kushtia to take up advanced position and intercept any Pak moves to Meherpur. Moreover, big trees had been felled all along the paved roads, and the ferry at Kholshakundi brought over to our side. Young people were all ready to bear arms and fight the enemy. "All we need are arms and ammunition to stand up to the enemy," I said empathetically. "I hope India will not be shy in offering us that help." The DM and BSF commandant heard me out attentively. I could guess that they were trying to measure me up. "What kind of political support do you have?" the DM quipped. "Well, if you know the background, it all started as a political movement, and because of the betrayal of the Pakistanis, it has taken this armed twist. I'm working in conjunction with the two MNAs who were elected from this part. The IAS DM was not to be convinced so easily. But do you have any contact with the central leaders?" I thought quickly and pulled a fast one. "Oh, sure. I contacted Rajarbagh the other day over wireless, and we have all been instructed to put up whatever resistance we can." Lieutenant Colonel Chakraborty intervened after a long silence. "I guess you know what it takes to fight and win against a professional army." My reply was honest but firm. "I know what you are hinting at. This struggle is not merely a military test. It is much more than that. It is going to be a test of determination of a nation against a superior killing machine. And history, Colonel Chakraborty, is going to be on our side. It is up to you whether you want to pick the winner now." I did not know how much convincing I could do, but sensed a mixture of disbelief, apprehension, and admiration in them at the daring, deadly, and determined game of a young man. Bhattacharya concluded the meeting saying, "Well, Mr. Chowdhury, best of luck. in your heroic struggle for independence. We admire you all. I shall brief the higher authority about our meeting today and your request for assistance. Colonel Chakraborty will be in touch with you. I started back for Meherpur with the courier as my guide. After about 100 yards, I looked back to see Mr. Bhattacharya and Colonel Chakraborty standing on the raised land on which the BOP stood. I waved. They waved back. March 30th, my men had been dispatched towards Kushtia on the orders of Major Osman. I had gone to Chuadanga to brief him on my meeting with the Indian officials, to find his headquarters humming with frantic activities, tense men in uniform moving in and out with urgent orders, walkie-talkies blurting out messages. The map on the wall was cluttered with new markings, arrows pointing towards Kushtia. The attack on Kushtia was on. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The moment had arrived to finally cross swords with the enemy. A message came to me to go out and meet Mahbub at the gate. Outside, his jeep was parked. I was introduced to the two passengers inside, Tajuddin Ahmed and Barrister Amirul Islam. I had never met Tajuddin Ahmed before, but knew of him as top-ranking political leader of the Awami League and the right-hand man of Bangabandhu. Knowing that the Pakistani army was throwing an ever-widening net around the country, both of them had traveled in disguise with assumed names of Rahmat Ali and Muhammad Ali, dressed shabbily to pass themselves off as ordinary village folks. Having left Dhaka in the wake of army crackdown, the duo had to make it on foot, village rickshaws and vans, taking circuitous routes and thereby avoiding any common thoroughfare, to meet up with Mahbub, whom they knew, at Jhinaidah. Mahbub, I guess, had briefed them on developments in the region under the leadership of Major Osman, my modest efforts to organize the resistance at Meherpur, and my recent contacts with the Indian authorities. They looked tired and worn out. Tajuddin was weary and ruminating while the younger Amirul Islam did the talking. We were asked whether a meeting could be arranged with anyone of responsible stature in the Indian government. Coincidentally, I was to go over to a BOP at Chenkhali the same day to meet up with the Indian authorities, hoping that someone of appropriate rank from the Indian government would turn up. We headed for the border without delay. As we passed, villagers stopped working in the field to wave at us, shouting, "Joy Bangla!" Women rushed outdoors, pulling the veil over their heads, throwing glances of admiration at us and showering silent good wishes. A scene from a fairy tale, a land awakened as if by a magic wand to reclaim itself. My guests were visibly impressed. After driving for a while, we had to leave the paved road for a herringbone patch and then along the dirt village paths. Having reached a point where the jeep wouldn't go any further, Mahbub and I left Tajuddin and Amirul Islam in the jeep and started walking towards the Indian border along a deserted road. As the canopy of the towering rain trees on the both sides darkened, the waning dusk, the bushes alongside seemed to transform into spectral characters, and the desolate path resonated with our footsteps, breaking the deafening silence. A man in uniform stepped out of nowhere to ask of our identity. Startled at first, we gathered our wits and told him who we were. Once satisfied, he walked with us for some distance as we saw the outlines of the barracks of the BOP. We were received by Lieutenant Colonel Chakraborty, who introduced us to Mr. Golok Mojumdar, the DG of Indian Border Security Forces, in short, BSF. We informed them of the fast-moving events, the ongoing attacks on enemy forces at Kushtia and reiterated our request for arms and ammunition. The discussion soon came around political support for our movement. What kind of political backing do you have? Asked Mojumdar. The armed struggle is being steered under the political leadership of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who had outlined our task in the event of a crackdown by Pak army. We are exactly following his directives. I stopped as I noticed Mojumdar was about to ask a question. But then, we are meeting you, government officials. Can you bring any central leader to talk to us? We were just waiting for such a question. Mahbub interjected. We have the two central leaders waiting in the jeep, Mr. Tajuddin Ahmed and Mr. Amirul Islam. Mojumdar and Chakraborty were taken aback, took a few moments to grasp at our abrupt reply and added, almost in chorus, "Then what are we waiting for? Do please bring them along." We rushed out, briefed Tajuddin about our conversation, the status of the Indian officials, one being the head of the border security force, and walked back to the BOP. The two Indian officials were waiting outside and warmly received them. As we sat down to discuss, we were given 2 LMGs from the armory of the BOP, ammunitions and barrels of POL. We drove back triumphantly, hoping to get the support we expected from the Indian side. We were not alone. In the meantime, the attack on Kushtia was entering its final phase. Heavily armed, 200-plus men strong, reconnaissance and support contingent of 27 Baluch Regiment had moved from Jashore Cantonment to Kushtia district headquarters with the firepower of a battalion. They had taken up position in a small area covering the circuit house, the police lines and the adjacent Jila school. A curfew had been imposed by Pak Army from March 26, confining the residents of the town to their homes. Activists and student leaders in Kushtia took this as an ominous sign and started secretly organizing resistance. In defiance, they took our possessions and even hurled cocktails at the enemy. In response, the army opened fire, killing one protester. A tense standoff took hold of Kushtia. Mayor Osman had planned a 3-pronged attack on enemy position to be led by Captain Azam, APR unit from the BOPs, 700 in number, and would form the main assault force backed by Ansar Mujahid volunteers from students and ordinary citizens as reserve. One column would lead the attack on the enemy from the southwestern direction towards the circuit house led by Captain Azam. Another company would move simultaneously from western flank towards the police line, and a third column would charge from the eastern side. The additional unit was to take position at the rear of Jhinaidaho, cutting any reinforcement from Jashore Cantonment as well, taking on the enemy if they were to retreat from Kushtia. All the planning and mobilization had to happen in extreme secrecy. As I would learn later, the textbook rule was for a striking force to have 3 times the strength of the enemy to launch an attack, provided the firepower was comparable. While the EPR was lightly armed with 303 LMGs, rifles, and obsolete rocket launchers, the enemy was armed to the teeth with superior firepowers, including modern Chinese weapons and Jeep mounted RR guns. The EPR was trained in border security and not for modern warfare, while the enemy was part of a professional army. We were no match. An attack on Kushtia was an audacious gamble. Major Osman had bet on three factors: a surprise attack, denying the enemy any worthwhile intelligence about us, and having a siege laid by tens of thousands of volunteers armed with shotguns, machetes, and bamboo sticks to deceive and overwhelm the enemy. Earlier, all the neighboring areas of Mirpur, Daulatpur, Bhedamara, Kumarkhali, and Khoksha got their answers mujahids and volunteers mobilized by Awami League leaders, an all-party action platform to respond to any call for collective action. Policemen, except for few who were in two minds, abandoned their station to join in. This ragtag assemblage carried 303 and 2x2 bore rifles and shotguns, anything they could lay their hands on. There were more. Truckloads of people chanting Joy Bangla also moved from Jhinaidaho, Harinakundu, Shoilokupa of Joshore district further south, bringing along with them dry food, supply of rice and lentils from their own fields, and of course whatever arms they could find. These groups, not in calculation of Major Osman, too converged towards Kushtia for coordinating the desperate enthusiasts moving in, as well as to monitor and share information. Several control rooms were established by Awami League leaders. Mega kitchens were set up to supply hot meals for those in the front. The field hospital with volunteer doctors was made operational to take care of the wounded. This spontaneous mobilization, appearing initially chaotic, all charged up for a mission of a lifetime, soon got organized. Gratuitous supply of resources kept pouring as if there were unlimited resources. Early dawn of March 30th, all our weapons simultaneously opened fire in line with the planned three-pronged attack, shattering the silence of the town, otherwise fast asleep. Thousands' voice roared, "Joy Bangla! Joy Bangla!" Pause. We were witnessing a fledgling people's war, a determined nation mobilized by Bangabandhu to reclaim its identity, dignity, and inalienable rights, was facing down on professional army waging a proxy war. Guns against voices, tyranny against dreams, fueled by a greed of military oligarchy. The assault companies were joined by men of all backgrounds, political activists, government officials, students, laborers, farmers, ordinary folks, all voluntary, shaking off the difference that ordinarily defined their status and places in society, fired up by an existential awakening that fused them into one soul to achieve one mission at any costs, liberating the country from the stranglehold of the enemy. This was history. The 27 Baluch was taken up by surprise. A fierce gun battle ensued for few hours. The deafening roar of the civilians, the unfamiliar sounds of the outdated guns of EPR, and attacks from three sides confounded them about our strengths and firepower. The 27th Baluch asked for reinforcements from Joshore Brigade, which was declined with the advice to them to fend for themselves. Major Osman's gamble had worked. Having taken heavy losses, the enemy morale weakened and then imploded, with the demoralized troops retreating in disarray towards their headquarters at the Zilla school. Our men pressed on, cornering them. We smelled victory. Firing continued throughout the day as more and more area were cleared of the enemy, capturing arms and ammunitions we needed so badly. By the evening, the remaining enemy officers and men got themselves holed up in the school building, making it clear that they had lost the will to fight. As the night progressed, the surviving men of the 27th Baluch made a sudden dash for Jashore in a truck and their officers in 2 jeeps under cover of heavy fire. The wily civilians, sensing such a possibility, had dug a trench on the road to Jashore next to the brigade and covered it up with plastic sheet to deceive the enemy. The vehicles moving in close formation bumped into one another in trench and were abandoned. As the enemy dispersed on the foot with automatic weapons, the villagers pursued them with shotguns, machetes, and even their bare hands. Except Lieutenant Ataullah, who was captured, no one survived or made it to Jashore cantonment. Our price? 6 dead and 11 wounded. Kushtia was ecstatic. The town burst into celebration with thunderous Joy Bangla echoing its nook and corners. Victory was so sweet and dizzyingly invigorating. There were other developments. I was informed that 2 Bangladeshi Pak army officers were lodging at the residence of Motiur Rahman, a lawyer magistrate of Meherpur. On hearing the news, I sent for them right away. 2 officers, Captain Mustafizur Rahman and Captain Salahuddin, had switched allegiance to Bangladesh and had traveled from Dhaka anonymously, mostly on foot, looking for resistance groups to join, eventually reaching Meherpur, where Motiur Rahman, elder brother of Captain Mustafiz, worked. Faced with the consequences of crossing swords with the professional army, any addition to our strength, and that too former captains of the Pak army, were a godsend. I embraced them warmly, welcomed them among us, and suggested taking them to Major Osman to enroll in our sector. In no time, we headed for Chuadanga. Major Osman had elated to 2 more officers, knowing that enthusiasm from people like me made for limited value in an armed struggle. Meherpur was soon becoming a transit point for refugee in India, and my office was issuing de facto visa, which the Indian authority was accepting. Trickle of civilians turned gradually into streams. They brought moving stories of valor, of resistance, and atrocities. Rajarbagh Police Headquarters and Pilkhana EPR headquarters were overrun under cover of curfew after stiff resistance from the lightly armed personnel of police and EPR against the attack of tanks and heavy weapons. The Pak army had mown down university students asleep in their dorms. Slums were razed and put to torch fire amidst the wails of children, women, and men. Hindu living quarters were targeted with a vengeance, reenacting scenes of Nazi persecution of the Jews. People were abandoning Dhaka once curfew was lifted, looking for safety outside. Kearniganj, on the other side of river Buriganga, was a refuge that many chose first. Pakistan army columns, like the Mongol hordes, chased them and gunned them down in their thousands, their bodies littered on the rice field, marshes, and floating in the river. While listening to these stories and fuming, I had the responsibility to sign off chits recommending entry to India, families who had abandoned their homes and fleeing from the demons to safety. But terror worked in many ways. On one occasion, a father with 2 tall, well-built young sons came to my office seeking my recommendation. I can understand why you are keen on getting to the safety of India. Why don't you leave your sons to fight with us? They are young and strong." And I added, somewhat jokingly, "Not frail like me." The father went pale and added, entreatingly, "I just have these 2 sons left in my family. I don't want to lose them." His eyes glistened with tears. Somewhat annoyed, I retorted, "What are we? Sons of some parents?" And wrote off the visa chits to get him out of my way. As I watched and signed off the visa permits, a long list of political leaders and student activists made their way to India through Meherpur. Journalists started pouring in from across India. They were impressed at the large area of Bangladesh that had been liberated and come under our control, driving away the enemy and confining them to Jessore cantonment. Trains started running between Gwalondo in Faridpur to Pakshi in Kushtia. Telephone lines were working under our supervision, even connecting us to the political leaders in Calcutta. We were in a euphoric mood, showing off the liberated area and captured arms and ammunition. Ambitions were running high on the heels of victory in Kushtia. How about laying the siege to Jessore cantonment with all our strength and 1 million citizens behind us, hoping for the same kind of victory as was in Kushtia? Already, the civilians around Jessore cantonment had refused to sell fresh rations and grocery to army personnel, reminding me of the instruction from Bangabandhu.
আমরা ভাতে মারবো, আমরা পানিতে মারবো।
One more push, and victory seemed to be ours. The journalist kept asking for one common question. Where is your government? Who are you fighting for? We had been sending messages to Mr. Tajuddin Ahmed. I did personally too, on the need to form and announce a government. Each time we raised the subject, Tajuddin reassured us, asking us to have patience. 3rd April 1971 started on an upbeat mood. We were parading our exploits of arms and ammunition, captures from the vanquished Pak army at Kushtia, machine guns, rocket launchers, recoilless rifles, other small arms, and a huge cache of ammunition loaded on captured vehicles, 30 in number, along the streets of Chuadanga. The crowds cheered all along the way, chanting, "Joy Bangla!" Adding to our strength, the scores of Bengali men from Army, Navy, and Air Force who were on home leave put their holiday aside and came to join the liberation force at Chuadanga, ready to fight to the end. We were on top of the world. In the meantime, Major Osman and other officers were huddled together, talking of a counterattack by the Pak army. I couldn't quite appreciate their conversation till it was brought home to me when fighter jets showed up in the sky above Chuadanga. The tiny dots came down in sharp, menacing dives over the barracks of the EPR in the heart of the town, firing their machine guns while dropping bombs that exploded with deafening sounds, making the earth tremble. As the air raid siren sounded, we jumped into the trenches that had been dug next to the Major Osman's headquarters. I was scared of this attack from the sky, against which we had no defense. One Jawan, braving all the risks, was firing from one of the heavy machine guns we had captured and mounted atop of the office building. The relentless bullets kept chasing the saber jets while we prayed for one hit on the planes. The jet made a number of audacious runs, but as if to raise the town and crash our morale. With the sound of the clear sirens, we came out of the trenches and ran to assess the casualties and damages. The barracks were in flames, the dead and the wounded lying around. Fire brigades had already reached the barracks trying to douse the fire. Few daredevils had put their life on line while trying to shoot the planes down with 303 rifles, and in the process got bullet wounds themselves. The small hospital was full of the wounded, a few needing amputation. All of a sudden, the fear of being overpowered by an unseen enemy had shaken our morale. An intrepid French TV journalist named Alfonso had been filming the refugees, children, women and men, young and old, half-clad, famished, trudging a long distance, occasionally 100 miles, on foot, looking for safety from the murderous attacks on the civilians unleashed by the Pak army. He was witnessing the bombing runs of the enemy jets and filming them, putting his life at risk. After it was all over, he interviewed me. Alfonso referred to the Biafran War in Nigeria, whose legacy of deaths and starvation was fresh in the mind of the world community, and tried to draw an analogy. This war reminds one of the recent Biafran War in which the Nigerian army tried to put down the secessionists. Alfonso commented, vehemently disagreeing with, I said, "This is no secession, no civil war, but a fight for independence from an absurd construct of history. A British contrarian solution, putting together a country whose two wings were 1,000 miles apart with nothing much in common to bind them. All these years since the partition of India in 1947, Bangladesh, its eastern wing, has been denied of its linguistic, cultural, and political rights, treated and exploited indignantly as a colony by its Western counterpart." I paused to take a breath. An EPR Havildar had passed on to me a few pieces of shell which confirmed that the jets had dropped napalm bombs banned internationally in any warfare. I continued, "Look at these pieces of shell. They are from napalm bombs. This is one more evidence of no-holds-barred strategy of Pak army, which killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians in the murderous orgy of ours on 25th and 26th March in the capital city of Dhaka. We are not going to rest till we have our country liberated from these perpetrators of heinous crimes." Alfonso looked convinced of my arguments. In the meantime, following the crackdown on Dhaka, we wanted to establish contact with Captain Hafiz, another Borishal Zilla school buddy of Mahbub and me, serving in 1st Bengal Regiment, stationed in Jashore cantonment and to ask him to switch sides. I sent letters trying to reach him through trusted courier to locations where his battalion was reportedly on the routine exercise, away from the cantonment, but didn't get any reply. So did Mahbub. But I had a hunch that it wouldn't be long before we met. I was taken aback at the sudden appearance of Captain Hafiz along with Mahbub at Major Osman's office. Seeing two old friends in khaki uniform, Hafiz of the army and Mahbub of police, was a shot in the arm for a civilian like me, who had jumped into a war without having any idea of what it all meant. At least, these guys have dealt with guns and bullets in their professions. This was the first time I was meeting Hafiz after he joined the Pakistan Army. A tall, well-built sportsman, once the member of Pakistan's national football team. Our pride, and to be honest, tinged with envy at his having stolen the limelight when the rest of us were in the shadows. One and a half decade back in school, Hafiz and I were two boys selected as the shortest in the class to stand in front of the assembly before the school started, while Mahbub enjoyed the honor of standing last in the line for being the tallest in the class. Since then, I stayed at very much the same height, while Hafiz grew into tall Tuffy, which I guess helped him to get into the Pakistan Army and ameliorate our image as weaklings. And here, we three had been brought by destiny to play together the last deadly game against a well-armed enemy. Hafiz's battalion, all manned by Bengali JCOs, NCOs, and Jawans, were asked to pack up from the exercise and move back to the headquarters in Jashore cantonment on 30th March. Slightly suspicious, they obeyed the order only to discover that they were to be disarmed by other units manned by West Pakistanis once they were inside the cantonment. The men of 1st Bengal couldn't take the treachery lying down, broke the armory in the cantonment, and got hold of the arms and ammunition they could lay their hands on. But the battalion by then was encircled by those who were peers hours back. A fierce fight ensued, and the 1st Bengal men were able to make a breach in the siege and head out the cantonment in small groups, just in time before they ran out of ammunition. The battalion regrouped in Chowgacha along the Jashore-Chuadanga highway, only to discover that many couldn't make it. Among them, young Lieutenant Anwar, who was one of the first to switch sides and fire upon the enemy when the battalion was being encircled. We were listening to Hafiz spellbound, proud as well as sad, of the bravery and the sacrifice in the inchoate hours of liberation war. Soon we were joined by one, Captain Huda, somewhat older than us, with asymmetric jaws, a signature of the torture he had suffered in the hands of Pak intelligence service, who had taken him to custody and made him a co-accused in the so-called Agartala conspiracy case against Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Captain Huda was thrown out of the army in 1969 at the apogee of the political movement against Pakistan. He seemed to appear from the wilderness, traveling a long distance to join the liberation forces at Chuadanga and finally settle his scores with the Pakis. Major Osman talked about linking up with Hafiz's regiment and planning jointly the future moves, but he needed a government to represent us very badly. Getting in touch with Tajuddin over phone, we pressed our demand. Tajuddin reconfirming that it was in progress and would be announced shortly. Some adventurous few suggested forming a provincial government from among us in Chuadanga and Meherpur, going so far as to propose the historic Amjhupi Nilkuthi as the place for the installation of the government. Nurul Kader Khan, DC of Pabna, having led the resistance against Pak army, then in retreat and lodged at Meherpur at my residence, was vocal among them. I shrugged aside such divisive political adventurism, and as the civilian head of Meherpur, no idea in my domain could get traction without my consent. After the liberation of Kushtia, it was decided to keep a small contingent of freedom fighters there and move the rest to locations to the south. One at Bishakhali and another at Kotchandpur, both south of Jhinaidaho, a thought advance of the Pak army from Jashore cantonment towards north. Major Osman, who decided to position a contingent, a company of EPR, some 10 miles away from Chuadanga, short of Jhinaidaho, on the Jashore highway to ambush any advancing enemy troops. Captain Salahuddin and I were to lead them. I was to abandon my responsibility as the SDO of Meherpur and make good of the uniform and my newfound status of an army officer with the rank of a captain. Days before, Major Osman had granted field commission to 3 of us: Mahbub, Shafiqullah, a teacher from Jhinaidaho Cadet College who had taken up arms, and me. On a night when Chuadanga was observing blackout in defense of any likely air raid, Havildar Mujib took me to the EPR barracks, dimly lit with kerosene lamps, and brought out a set of khaki uniforms they had found for me. I put on the uniform while they pinned the 3 pips of captain on my shoulder, came to attention and saluted me, saying, "You are, from now, our officer, and we are at your command." I was moved and thrilled, not knowing what was expected of me in war, but determined not to let down my men. Already wearing khakis, boots and peeps on my shoulder, I phoned my second officer, Hafiz, at Meherpur to take charge of the subdivisions as I was getting fully involved in the armed struggle and was heading towards a forward defense position. I tagged along with Salahuddin, and once we reached the planned location, let him give instruction of the layout of the troops, setting up communication and the command post. Elements of our troops would interject the enemy while the other group would ambush and third group will provide the covering fire if we were to retreat. It was raining past midnight. We heard loud sounds of explosions and shells whizzing past our positions. Salahuddin told me that these were artillery fires meant to soften our position, typically the precursors of an attack. Soon the shells started falling close to our location. We were sitting duck, since our small arms were no answers to the shells falling from the sky. Salahuddin apprehended that the tanks might accompany the attacking elements. We didn't stand a chance to ambush such overpowering forces. We got in touch with Major Osman for further instructions. Soon, we were asked to retreat. Orderly retreat had always been a challenging task in any war. Our troops started packing haphazardly, some in a panic mode. Salahuddin shouted abuse to keep them in line. At the end, when the company started its way towards Chuadanga, we took to walking back, leaving the paved road through newly furrowed paddy fields. Unused to wearing boots, I was finding it difficult to keep pace with Salahuddin in the pitch dark of night, as my feet were getting bogged in the mud and my glasses blinded with rain. I pleaded with Salahuddin not to abandon me. He assured me with a pat on my back. We took a break in what appeared to be a one-room church, standing in the middle of the fields. I was shivering in the wet clothes, the boots filled with water, and took out the pack of cigarette which was just about to get wet. Salahuddin stood guard at the door with his AK-47 while I had few puffs which helped me calm down my nerves to an extent. We still didn't know what to do next. Before dawn, Salahuddin decided to go out in the open and try finding our ways to Chuadanga. Stealthily, we walked into the yard of a farmer whose family was just waking up for the day. Salahuddin was in no mood to take any chance and shouted, "Hands up!" to the male person he first came across with his AK-47 loaded and uncocked. All other of the family came out and were about to scream, but shouted down by Salahuddin. We told them that we were freedom fighters and had lost our way. "Did you see any elements of the Pak army going past this place?" Salahuddin asked. "We heard some noises of vehicles when asleep. We don't know who they were," answered one, still holding his hands up. Salahuddin let the guy take down his hands and warned them not to tell anyone about our presence. We started walking north towards Chuadanga, avoiding the paved road. After a while, to our great surprise, we found our driver Khushid hiding in a dirt road with the jeep. We jumped in and headed for Chuadanga. The situation in Chuadanga was chaotic. Major Osman had decided to move his headquarters to Meherpur, where rear headquarters were already been set up, calling it a tactical retreat, a term I heard for the first time. Not quite understood what it all meant. The EPR members and their families were hurriedly packing up whatever belongings they could take along, throwing them at the back of the trucks and jumping in. Panicked civilians were scurrying away from the town. Fear and apprehension writ large on their faces. Once the headquarters of a victorious force, Chuadanga was melting away in the fear of the unknown. I stood dazed at the sudden turn of events and unraveling of our dream of a quick victory. Here in prison today, lying on my bed from another world, I listen with stoic detachment and occasionally take a languid look at the old footage shown on BTV. The commentator makes emotional reference to our glorious past, the many fights we fought and sacrifices we made, saluting our heroes. Little did he know what a cruel satire was being played out for me. What does imprisonment mean to us? It's the loss of control over our own life, absence of choice, and surrender to the rules of restricted existence. Rationality loses its meaning here. It's a robotic life. A lockout during the day extends into boundary of existence, while a lockup at night shrinks the space. There is a circle. The space around us expands and contracts. Mathematically, max-min. One of the many jail barbers, Zia, a diminutive middle-aged man, not even weighing 100 pounds, having served 16 years of his 25-year sentence, has his own questions. He had put them to one former minister in custody. Why did your administration evict the slum dwellers? Didn't they have claim on the state? Why did you bulldoze Tanbazar red light area? Those were mothers and sisters too. Didn't they have a claim on the state? Why did the justice system that sent him to jail forget that after serving such a long years with a good record, he has been cutting hair and shaving beards all these years to the satisfaction of clients? He was entitled to be set free. But then what is out there for me? My wife is dead. My son is lost. And I have no one to visit. And I have none to visit me. The outside world has no relevance for me except that I feel occasionally to be able to go out and walk freely without being stopped or questioned. I have forgotten what that feeling is like. That is not the whole story though. The soul can never be chained, and I have redefined my existence in a spiritual tenor. Days has been sliced into 5 pieces, each defined by a prayer. I see my life as part of a continuum of over 5 millennia, from the Abraham to Prophet Muhammad. My soul seeks peace along with the pilgrims of eternity, floats away into antiquity to join the faraway caravan of men trudging the star-studded desert night, half lit in mystical aura. We have a Hindu companion, Nikhil. He is lost in the Gita and the stories that run back 6 millenniums. And the stories that run back 6 millenniums. Lord Krishna's advice and counseling to the warrior Arjun on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. An allegory for the ethical and moral struggles of human life. Nikhil sees his term with his misfortune in those ancient scripts. Stories of triumphs and tragedies, death and reincarnation. Prison is as much the death of a person as it is a rebirth of another.